Meeting of the Metropolitan Council Transportation Committee from Monday, August 26, 2019. Our first order of business is approval of the agenda. Does anyone have any changes or additions to the agenda? If not, I'd entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Motion and second. Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. And we have an approved agenda. Next, we're on to the approval of the minutes from the August 12th, 2019 meeting. Did anyone have changes or additions to the minutes? All right. If not, then I'd entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved. Second.
Motion and second. Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Minutes are approved. Next, we're on to the tab liaison report.
Thank you, Madam
Mr.
Chair.
Finn.
Madam Chair, General Manager S. Quaistra. Of course, council members, Director Thompson. This is going to be very brief because we have experts, Amy and Steve Peterson, Amy Benowitz, presenting the main items. And, well, thank you very kindly, sir. Thank you. I forget who I was. I am. Presenting the defederalization concept and also the regional solicitation. So I'm going to confine my comments just to a couple of update items from the different commissions that report to the tab. The first, MAC, and I'll again confine my comments to things your constituents may ask you about. As you most likely know, the Highway 5 will be shut down. The entrance or the access to the airport will be shut down from April to November of next year. There'll only be access going in one direction. There's a couple bridges that need to be repaired, so it's going to be in and out. When the southbound is closed, northbound will be open, et cetera. But primarily the access is going to be from like 77 Cedar and going around behind the airport. So the travel times are going to really increase. And I know General Manager Quaistra is working feverishly on the bus access to that, because it's going to be really something. And then the three additional in the south checkpoint, 3 additional lines will be open by December, by Christmas. But we will have to go through the Labor Day holiday and the Thanksgiving holiday. So if your constituents should ask, but that relief is coming. And on last Monday, the airport passed the 40,000 passengers per day mark, which is pretty exceptional. 41,000 were for the NCAA. The PCA, Pollution Control Agency, is going into the public comment of phase 2, which is $23 million over 4 years, draft plan in the fall. And last but not least, MnDOT, they talked about functional classifications, which we won't go into now. But Chair Hovland, in a bit of humor, said, would anybody like to propose more road construction or closures to the MnDOT? No. And I do want to remark that I noted Councilmember Fredson's great photo on the front page of the Pioneer Press next to the mayor. I do have it in my briefcase for an autograph if you have time afterwards. Right. And I enjoyed, if I may say, Madam Vice Chair, the newsletter had your bio in it, and I enjoyed that very much, and I have a copy here as well, so autographs when we're finished. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dugan. Does anyone have any questions? All right. If not, we will move on to for the reports. We have MTS Director Thompson.
Madam Chair and members, tonight I'm going to defer the report because the bulk of what we are working on in the past few weeks is being covered on the agenda. So we'll just, nothing else to report besides what we have on the agenda tonight.
Okay. Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Thompson? All right. Then we'll move on to General Manager Quaistra.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I will give a couple reports today that include some slides and video. The first one is on the State Fair Service. We're into, I think, our 5th day here. I'm not counting. If I'm counting correctly, and we've had some record attendance because the weather's been absolutely beautiful. And so we thought it might be timely to give you just a mini brief on how the State Fair Service is going. And I've asked Brian Funk, who is the manager of the over the bus services, the deputy manager of the bus services, to provide that overview.
Thank you. Welcome.
Madam Chair, council members, again, Brian Funk, and I'll provide you with just a brief overview, and as the general manager indicated, a short snippet video. But here's a really nice picture of our A-line service running on Snelling right outside the main gates. Here's some preliminary ridership through the first 4 days. The blue is last year, 2018 rides. The orange indicates this year, 2019. And so you can see that, Thursday we were pretty close. Friday was a fantastic day, and The numbers represented here, that 52,000 number on a weekday is really unheard of. That used to be a good number on the weekends. You look at Saturday, again, well over 60,000, and even Sunday was strong. So the total fair rides were just shy of 200,000 rides from our 10 express sites. It's up about 3% from last year, which is a good sign, especially considering that we have 3 fewer site locations that we're operating from this year. The total fair rides, again, this is early, but we're estimating that it's a little over 211,000 versus 205,000 at the same point last year through Sunday. So it's about 16% of fairgoers. Really strong number. Goes to show that the marketing and service we provide is excellent. And so Tane Danger, who's a local comedian, he's done a couple of videos for us about Where's My Bus. He did one, a nice one out of Maplewood Mall. So I'll show that real quick here.
Our state fair is a great state fair. Don't miss it, don't even be late. Our state fair is a great state fair. The best state fair in our state.
Tane Danger here with, hey, where does this bus go? State Fair edition. We know where this bus is going. It's one of the many park and ride buses that take people from around the Twin Cities Metro to the Minnesota State Fair, the Great Minnesota Get Together. So almost all Metro Transit employees at some point during the 12 days of the Minnesota State Fair take a shift as a ambassador. I'm a Metro Transit ambassador now. I can answer any questions. Anybody has a question about the fair, about Metro Transit, about the future? Do people just want advice? What's your question?
I wanted to know if my daughter-in-law is going to have a boy or a girl.
Well, first, just to ask you a question, is she pregnant?
I have a question about your bow tie.
So my bow tie was carved out of the original forest where the state fair is.
Do you have any Ferris wheels?
Do I have any Ferris wheels? Well, not on me. Okay, you and I have like the same haircut, I think. Who wore it better? How do you get your hair like this every day? You have the best earrings. Are these like special state fair earrings?
My husband and I were Cattle Patrol, it was called.
There's a cattle patrol? Metro Transit has an app on which you can actually get your tickets for the State Fair Express. Very easy, very convenient. It is cheaper than paying in cash. And bam! I saved $1 that I can now put towards 1 extra cheese curd. Somebody told me you've been going to the fair for a long time.
80 years.
80 years?
I'm 87.
And how long have you been doing it with the bus?
Just a couple of years. Because I was driving and it was horrible and I could never find a place.
Have you ever tried to drive to the fair?
We used to. This was like in the 60s, and you could park on the fairgrounds.
What? Were there any rules in the 60s?
Not really.
Why would I drive out there? I don't know.
Yeah, why would you drive out there? We're looking at people in the camera who drive to the fair like, what are you doing? Hey, Metro Transit sign, where should I board the bus? So, can you tell me, so you're taking the bus to the fair. Do you always do that?
Well, we have, yes, in the past.
How does taking the bus compare to driving and parking?
Oh, it's much better, much better.
All right, well, from this incredibly uncomfortable position, that's hey, where does this bus go? High-speed interview edition. Thank you. We're here in downtown Minneapolis, and where are you taking the bus?
I'm taking the bus to the fair. I normally take the express bus.
Right. So this is like a bus hack, because you figured out, oh, this local bus gets to the fair.
Correct.
In the transit-only lane, it is your red carpet to the Minnesota State Fair. Hey! The buses dropped us off right here by the entrance, and we didn't drive, and we didn't park, and we're here, and now we can eat, we can do a Ferris wheel. You just took the bus to the fair.
We did.
How was it?
Great.
A lot of people want to take the bus.
And it's great. I highly recommend it.
Most buses should go to the fair. Reroute all buses to the fair.
All right, so you can see that we like to have a lot of fun, and credit to Bruce Howard's team who pulled this together and was able to make this work on really short notice, and so they pulled it together. It turned out fantastic. So, and then real quick, we'll see just a few more pictures, maybe. Nope. All right. I'll bow
We'll
out.
call that technical difficulties,
Yep,
Madam
I'll bow
Chair.
out, but just so you know, things are going really well. This is State Fair number 18 or 19 for me. And, we have some long lines in the morning, but as soon as those the buses get rolling, things catch up. Things have been going really smoothly. Try to communicate with our customers, social media, rider alerts, staff on site to make sure that they know exactly what's going on, especially in the event where something fills up. So feels like we're doing a good job, and everybody's really engaged. So
Great.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, then I also mentioned that after the State Fair service, we moved right into school services, and this year we anticipate more than 10,000 students from 60 area high schools having a student pass. One unique thing about this year with the college passes is that in Augsburg, student passes will be part of their of each student's tuition and fees. So they will have free rides as part of that. I won't call it free. They do pay part of the fee for that, and the college subsidizes part of it. But it's the first college to include a free pass as part of the student fee and tuition structure, and we're excited about that, and they're excited about that. And as I understand, the students are excited about that as well. And then I'll also mention that the region's first bus lane opened last week on a stretch of southbound Chicago Avenue. That lane allows buses to bypass traffic. They're painting those lanes red. I've seen pictures of them. They should be very apparent to other drivers to not use the bus lane. This week, portions of East 28th Street and Lake Street are going to be bus only to help buses move through the corridor as construction begins. I know they were going to paint those, I believe, over the weekend, but decided that they could not because of the rain that occurred, so they'll be painted going forward. And then Hennepin Avenue bus lanes will be created by restricting street parking during weekday peak periods. So those lanes will also be painted red and signs around that as well. And then finally, we're going to be starting, we have started an annual fall campaign celebrating customers' ability to safely use mobile devices. And Bruce Howard, our Director of Marketing, is here to talk a little bit about that campaign and hopefully have some slides.
Yes, good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the Transportation Committee. Bruce Howard, Director of Customer Services and Marketing. As the General Manager said, in the fall, we typically do a rather large advertising campaign. It's the time when people are getting back to their normal schedules, and we want them to think about how they get around, get to work, get to school, those kinds of things. Plus, as you saw, all those great people on the buses going to the State Fair, we also want to see if we can now get them to try some of our regular route service as well. So this year, what we did with our objective was really develop an integrated campaign with an overarching theme that focused on convenience, ease of use, and good value. The audience that we're targeting with this is our millennials. So those who are 22 to 37 or roughly in that age area. One of the things we saw from some research we did at the end of last year was that the awareness and the importance that millennials gave to transit was decreasing, and so we wanted to make sure and get out and get in front of them with a message about transit. We're going to be highlighting some of our technology that we have, things like our mobile app, mobile ticketing, next trip real-time information, track your bus, track your train. If you haven't seen those, I'm happy to help you look at those sometime. And then the campaign will kick off here. It kicked off last week and it'll run through November 4th. Here's just an example of some of the types of advertising that will be out there. The top two that you see here are actually Facebook ads, so social media. The first one here on your left, why worry about new Minnesota hands-free law? Text away on Metro Transit. So we thought that was a timely one to get in front of people. Let us do the driving. On the right-hand side, you can see that ad here. get real-time departure information for your routes, track your ride. So track your bus, track your train. At the bottom is an example of the bus wrap that we'll have out there. We actually will have 5 buses wrapped with this creative that go along with that campaign. In addition to that, we're going to have other digital ads out there. We're going to have digital radio and traditional radio, some online banners. We're going to be doing some direct mail on some of our high-frequency routes, and a few other things that we'll probably throw in there along the way. And then finally, I just want to end by giving you a glimpse of a digital video that we put together here. Again, as I mentioned, we're focusing on millennials, and of course, if you're familiar with millennials or have some at home, you know that they don't put their phones down at all. So we need to reach them where they're at, and where they're at is looking at their phones. And so we put together a little video that talks about all of the ways that they can access Metro Transit technology with their phones. So if you can roll that, Greg. So that's an example of one of the videos that will be out there, and those are going to be attached to some of our online banner ads. We'll be putting those out actually at our digital kiosks along the rail lines. We're using it on social media and other places. And of course, then we'll be tracking all of the activity that we have, the communications activity in terms of things like impressions and click-throughs, and also be checking back with our survey at the end of the year on behavior change. So I want to see if we can increase the awareness or the consideration and obviously the usage by that millennial group. So that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you. Any questions? Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have 2 questions. First of all, do you have a sense of how successful the app has been for rides to the fair this year? Or is it premature?
Yeah, Madam Chair and Council Member, you know, we were trying to get that data before we came over here, and I can tell you that we had a big increase in revenue on Saturday. I won't be able to tell you, though, the breakout, unfortunately. So typically we do about $3,000 a day on the app. We did almost $30,000 on Saturday, but there was also a Vikings game that went on there. So, but I think that indicates that a lot of people are using that app, and we'll be able to get you those final numbers, obviously.
Good. Thank you. My other question, I'm just curious when you said that it looks like millennial use is dropping. We always hear the statistic that millennials, one of the top 3 reasons they select an area to put down roots and raise their families is the access to a robust transit and transportation system. So how does that fit with millennials dropping off of use?
Yeah, Madam Chair, Council Member, well, what I was talking about was awareness of transit and then relevancy of public transit. So when you do that survey, and I'm not sure exactly why, but we saw a drop in relevancy, and that kind of concerns us. Now, one of the things that it may be, and I'm just surmising here, is that with Lyft, Uber, all of these other options out there, they may not be as aware of public transit. That's why we thought we needed to get in front of them and keep us kind of front and center.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions for Mr. Howard? All right, very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh,
I had a
hang on.
question for
Please,
Wes.
I
I had a question for Wes. Just
Okay.
to follow up. Thank you, Chair. What is the fee that we're charging Augsburg, or per student? Or if you don't know that, maybe
I can get
back
that.
to us.
I can get that, Council, Madam Chair, Councilmember. I can get that information back to you, and I'll also get you information on how that whole fee is structured inside their student fee system.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's just a great idea. I mean, I went to Hamlin for college, and with so many schools in the city, not only the city of St. Paul, but across the metro, I think it's just a huge way to get people in right from the get-go.
Yeah. Madam Chair, if I just say that's the exciting part about working with colleges. The more we can get in there, we're creating new riders, getting people used to transit, getting used to transit with their peers. Because it can be intimidating for some people in the beginning. And so we see it as an inroad to future users, as you're suggesting there.
Any other questions for General Manager Cloister? Oh, good. Thank you. All right. Next, we move on to business. We have no items on consent tonight. We move to our non-consent items. The first item is business item 2019-181, Southwest Light Rail Transit SCADA contract agreement. We have Matt Gorman. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair, committee members. My name is Nat Gorham. I am the Manager of Contracts and Risks for Southwest LRT. I'm here today to present a sole source contract with Collins Aerospace for SCADA programming for Southwest LRT in an amount of $50,303,023. To give you all a background in what SCADA is, it stands for Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition. It's the means by which the council remotely controls and monitors LRT service on its alignment. And it does so through SCADA points. We have hundreds of thousands of these SCADA points along the alignment. And the SCADA points send information to our Rail Control Center. And it allows the Rail Control Center to remotely control LRT service, to monitor where trains are at, to turn off and on switches, and to check the status of a TPSS, for instance, or a signal. Now, this contract will extend our existing SCADA service along the alignment for Southwest from Target Field to Southwest Station. The contract is primarily programming and testing. There was a construction part of it that we pulled out and put into our systems contract to make this contract more of an engineering contract. So there's no prevailing wage in this. It's primarily engineering services. So if you're thinking about the LOMP tails to this, is not in our LOMP application because it's primarily engineering, which is pre-award. So you may know the name Collins Aerospace. You may know them as Rockwell Collins. They were formerly Rockwell Collins. They were formerly Air Inc. before that. We currently run a Collins Aerospace SCADA system on to run our LRTs. It's a registered trademark of Collins Aerospace. It's called the AIM platform. It's a type of SCADA platform. And that's the reason why in February 2017, we brought a suite of Collins Aerospace services to the council for approval. Excuse me. It allowed us to, it gave us the authorization to negotiate this contract, to negotiate a similar contract for Blue Line, and to negotiate several other maintenance and support and smaller enhancement projects for the whole service with Collins Aerospace. And the reason, and there's a lot of other SCADA programs out there, the reason this is sole source eligible is that in order to bring in a new SCADA program, you've got to retest all of these SCADA points. That's why the SCADA points part of this is important. It requires you to reprogram all of these SCADA points and to retest them in between live trains, either or by doing a partial shutdown or full shutdown, to make sure that each of these SCADA points that they install and the existing SCADA points are all speaking correctly to our Rail Control Center. So we negotiated the terms and conditions with Collins Aerospace for a long time. We're at the finish line. We have a price that's within 10% of our estimate, and so we're asking you to approve this contract.
Thank you.
And that's all I have. If you have questions, I'd be happy to take them, Madam Chair.
Any questions from council members? All right, if not, then I would entertain a motion to approve business item 2019-181.
Motion to approve.
Second.
Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. And business item is adopted. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair, committee members.
Next, we are on to business item 2019-240, Anoka County Debt Defederalization Request. And we have Nick Thompson and Steve Peterson.
Madam Chair and committee members, I thought I'd start this business item out tonight by giving an overview of what defederalization of projects are. This is an overview that we gave to TAB last week, and we thought it kind of just gave a general overview before we got into the item itself, so it might prompt some questions you have or help you answer some questions you have about the item when we get into that. So this is a presentation we made at TAB, and then we'll get into the business item itself. So Defederalization is a term that is how we've been referring to this at TAB, but it also is the similar terms are federal funds swap or federal funds exchange. It's really defined as taking a set of projects that have federal funding on them and rearranging the money so that fewer of the projects actually have any federal funds on it. It doesn't change anything about the project scope itself, but it allows for different processes for a project that does not have federal funds on that. So I'll refer to it as defederalization. It's the term we've used mostly when these items have come up in the past, but just you might hear it explained in other ways. So projects remain the same. It's trying to simplify a process by moving the funding around. This is a process that is fully allowed at the federal level and sometimes encouraged by either FTA or Federal Highway Administration as an administrative process that can affect projects. The defederalization is one practice that is used in Minnesota by the council, by other agencies. It has a variety of practices of how it's implemented from a policy standpoint around the nation. And some states do it much different than it is done in Minnesota, and it kind of goes back to how they are allowed to spend their transportation dollars. And some of the options that might be available in Iowa or other states are not available in Minnesota because of restrictions on our state or local funding here in the state. So why would you defederalize a project? It's almost always for efficiency standpoints. There is no disagreement about that federal funding on a project adds complexity and time over a project that does not have federal funds. So it's become simpler to administer. There's a few process steps that can save weeks or months in a project development process, and sometimes you need to save those weeks or months to get a project delivered for some reason. And so it's not necessarily that common a practice, but it's one that is used often because there's an efficiency need by the project sponsor to move a project up or get a project into construction sooner. There's a lot of debate about, does this save you money? Does it save a project money? Clearly, you hear the phrase time is money, and you're saving some time in this process. And it's been theorized that it can save up to 30% of the cost of a project. I think that's maybe on smaller projects. On a larger project, there isn't. You still have the same construction costs and other cost inputs, so you might save a little bit on a few items, but there's no conclusive evidence about how much money you would save from defederalizing a project. But you definitely do save time. When you think about a project that has federal funds and one that does not, there's kind of two phases where it has an impact on the project itself. There's the project development phase, when you're designing it, doing your studies for that project, and then there's a construction phase, and I'll talk about the differences. When you have a federal money on a project, even if it's $1 of federal funds, you follow a federal environmental process or NEPA process. When there's no federal money on it in Minnesota, we follow the Minnesota environmental process. And in our state, we really have very similar federal and state environmental processes. I think the state has done a lot. It's been a key driver in our state to make sure that the standards for environmental regulations in our state are close to federal or higher in some cases. And so we don't see much difference in our state always between those two. In other states, there's a big difference between a federal environmental process and a non-federal environmental process. And so it might be a different answer to that question if we were in a different state for defederalization. There is federal laws about environmental justice and the analysis of a project on a federal that do not apply to state, but we do have practices that are similar to what are federal regulations. When you have a federal project, you have some very specific tribal consultation requirements that you follow. In our state, I think now the council is governed under the executive order by the governor for tribal relations. MnDOT has been under that for a long time. Cities and counties are not under that executive order, so I think that is one key difference that can occur between a project that is a city project with federal funds, that same project if it did not have federal funds. Projects in question today, I do not think have any issues related to where they're located and tribal, but the county has promised to look into that issue to make sure that they're not, that if there's any consultation, that they will conduct that.
Councilmember Chambliss.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'm interested in knowing how the tribal requirement by the governor,
Yes.
how long does that last?
Madam Chair, Councilmember, the executive order that the Governor Walz signed that included the council basically says that we as the council need to do consultations ongoing for all our projects and also for all our processes. And so projects in question today will be ones led by Anoka County, so they are not part of that executive order. So we would approach tribal consultation under the executive order as ongoing until, as long as that executive order is in place. Now, if there are any federal funds on a project like Southwest LRT, that falls under tribal consultation of federal law. And so this is just for projects that do not have that. So I guess it's our intent as the council to go ongoing. The council just recently adopted a tribal policy, and so kind of flowing from that executive order, and now we would be following that, and I think procedures are still in development on that tribal policy for the council, if that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
The last, any?
No, go ahead.
Okay. The last part is there's different oversight of both a design and engineering phase. When it's there's a federal oversight role that goes away, but we have our own oversight. The agencies have their own oversight. So I just pointed out is that there are some differences on who's providing oversight between a federal and non-federal. Another phase is actually when you're getting to procurement and construction of a project. That's where there's some differences. And it depends on your agency what those differences are. A disadvantaged business, or DBE, is a federal requirement. So any project with federal funds follows the DBE requirements. When there's no federal requirements at the council, we have MCUB. At MnDOT, they have one similar to MCUB. They have a targeted group business. Hennepin, Ramsey, St. Paul, and Minneapolis have a program that's similar to MCUB called CERT. And in many sense, it's very similar to disadvantaged businesses, but slightly different in a few ways that are different. Outside of those agencies I mentioned, though, they do not have a similar program to DBE. And it's an issue that was raised in this business item, and I think Anoka County came up with a creative way to kind of deal with that issue by working with MnDOT to invest in small business construction projects that would be similar to the DBE requirements that they had if they would continue to have their federal projects. The other two contractual ones are on federal requirements for prevailing wage and on-the-job training requirements in the contracting. When we raise those issues with Anoka County, it seems like their wages that would be on the contracts would be higher than prevailing wage, and they're looking into adding some language that would be similar to OJT on their contracts. Buy America is a clause at the federal level that talks about where the source of your materials comes from. Often it's applied to steel or technology on a construction project. So that is a requirement that is on federal projects, but not on non-federal. But in Minnesota, there's been a comparable requirement to Buy America that has been recently added to a lot of state bonding projects, and the language for that is going to be added to these contracts by Anoka County. So though it's a little bit different, it's the same principle of trying to buy materials that are going to be used on the project from U.S. sources. And so they've come up with a solution to that. And again, in the contracting phase, who provides oversight, if it's federal or non-federal, is different. So really, you're gaining efficiency on this project, but you're having some trade-off with these other construction and development that I just mentioned. And so because of those trade-offs, there's been some opposition to something like defederalization in the past. TAB had a very lengthy discussion about this item this year, and in 2015, when a similar item came before TAB, discussion about this. And I think what's different tonight is that the business item tried to address the issues that may raise when you defederalize a project by having contractual language on Buy America and creating this alternative to the disadvantaged business programming and having a way to deal with prevailing or wages on the labor of the contracts. And so the item is different today than the last time it came before council because they've really tried to work with us and with MnDOT as the fiscal agent on trying to mitigate some of those issues in order to gain the efficiency. The reason they want efficiency on this project is they need this project done before a parallel project by MnDOT is under construction, so it's less disruption to the public on this project.
And I just want to comment a little bit about the discussions that have been going on. There was, like I said, a lengthy discussion at TAB. There also have been good conversations taking place between the council and MnDOT, and also with council and Anoka County. I think Anoka County really has gone a great have really proceeded in good faith in trying to come up with ways to align with everything for this particular item. However, the discussions we had is leading to, we would like to get to a place down the road, or has prompted this discussion, where having frameworks for other counties or cities who want to defederalize, at least have a framework with which to meet these requirements, so that, you know, they can have it as an option, but they will know what we expect for them to have in place, both as a council and at TAB. So I don't know if that, any other comments on that?
No, that was a good summary of where we ended last week. So but tonight I just wanted to highlight those differences before we get into the business item. And the item itself is because Anoka County received 3 regional solicitation projects, and that's the point of where they're trying to rearrange their funding in order to deliver those projects. But it's an action before council whether they can do that. So,
Councilmember Chambliss.
Madam Chair, Mr. Thompson, just a question about potential advantages of defederalization for small businesses in terms of access and opportunity. For example, maybe that business being able to take on a project of a smaller scope. Is that one of the differences?
Madam Chair and members, I think smaller projects benefit from not being federal because they are much more complex in that as a contractor, we've heard indications that it's easier to be a small contractor on a project that is not federal than one that is federal because there's just more requirements. But there's no, you kind of give up some of the guarantees that come with federal of DBE and some other elements which are requirements of project with federal funds. But it's also an advantage, smaller projects, because of their complexity. If you're a city with a small project that received money through the regional solicitation and you've never done a federal project, that's a pretty big hurdle to learn how to follow a federal process versus one that has been not federalized. And so there's advantages for local communities sometimes on a smaller project. If you're doing bigger projects, they often have you're maybe more used to working on a federal project if you're a contractor or a city or county that's done federal larger projects because they often have federal funds in them.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So any project that would be requesting defederalization would be some project that had gone through the TAB regional solicitation process.
Madam Chair, members, those are the ones that have been coming before TAB. There can be, council can do some defederalization of projects within its own funding or another agency that has received federal funds in some other way. Typically, most in our region, most of the cities or counties are receiving their federal funds through the regional solicitation process. So that's often where the locals will have that opportunity to defederalize in our region.
So what then is TAB's role in the process of defederalization?
Madam Chair, council members, so in this case, what's actually transacting is these were 3 projects that are in the TIP, draft TIP, and we're going to take federal funds off of 2 and rearrange them. So they'll technically become, the 2 that are non-federal will no longer be in the TIP. And so, but TAB awarded these projects federal funds, and so those who receive the federal funds they can't just do this without permission from the TAB and the council to make this change. And so because it came through the TAB, through regional solicitation, they have to go back and ask for that step. The practical policy or procedural step is to then it amends the TIP, like a TIP amendment, which often comes through here through transportation and TAB. But in reality, they're asking for permission to change an award that they had previously received through the regional solicitation process.
Okay, thank you.
All right, additional questions? All right, if not, then I would entertain a motion to approve business item 2019-2040.
So moved.
I have a motion, is there a second?
Second.
Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay, and motion carries. So the next step is determining what goes on our consent agenda. I think both items probably proceed to the full council. Does that have to? Full council? All right, so if anyone disagrees, you're going to listen to me talk more at a council meeting. So, all right, so we'll move on to information items then. So the first one is the Regional Solicitation Work Group update. We have Amy Venowitz and Steve Peterson. Steve's sitting back. Amy's got it.
I think I'm going solo today. Madam Chair and members, somebody's going to do that for me, right? So today I will be presenting on the proposed recommendations for revising the regional solicitation, application and funding process for the next version of the solicitation, which we're calling it the 2020 solicitation, but we need to get the revisions agreed to and put in place now so we are ready to release the solicitation in 2020. So the recommendations that are coming, or that I'll be summarizing today, were developed by a policy work group that was created by TAB, and it included both TAB, primarily TAB members, but also council members. Barber and Cummings represented the council on that work group. So before I delve into the recommendations, a quick reminder, what is the regional solicitation? It is a process to allocate approximately $180 million in federal transportation funds that the region and the council as the MPO receives under federal law. In our region, we have developed a process whereby we primarily distribute the funds to locally initiated projects, but they are projects that directly support regional goals and objectives. We run the process every 2 years, and the projects that receive funding are receiving funding for 4 to 5 years in advance. So for instance, projects that will receive funding in the 2020 solicitation are receiving federal funds that the region gets in 2024 or 2025. And the reason that we're so far ahead of when they receive the funds is that most of these projects take a long time to further develop and design and be ready to be constructed in 2024 and 2025. The process is a very transparent process. It's driven by TAB, but overseen by the council. And it's also a very technical and data-driven process. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the solicitation overall. Typically what happens is as we move from solicitation to solicitation, in large part, we keep the overall framework of the solicitation, but we tweak it on the margins. And we always have 1 or 2 issues that come up, and that's what we'll be discussing today primarily, is how are we going to be changing the solicitation to address some of the issues that came up in the 2018 solicitation. So this slide While the process overall primarily awards funds to local projects that are sponsored by cities, counties, park agencies, and transit providers, those are the typical applicants, we have set up a process that is very tied back to regional policy, and particularly to Thrive and the TPP. So the framework that we've established, we have outcomes in Thrive that the region has identified. We have transportation system goals that are specified in the transportation policy plan adopted by the council. And then the solicitation goes the next step, and it creates criteria and then scoring measures against which all the projects are evaluated and scored. And so in the end, the local projects that score the highest are the projects that give us the closest representation of the Thrive outcomes and TPP goals. So even though we're funding maybe smaller level local projects, in total, they're all adding up together to give us steps towards achieving where the region wants to go. And that is a very important piece of the regional solicitation, and I think sometimes we get mired in the details and forget that in the end, the projects that score are the ones that are going to help us get to where we want to be. So having said that, while the solicitation is rooted in tying back to regional policy, one of the issues that always comes up is also regional balance. And regional balance is also a very important piece of the solicitation, but it is a lens or a piece that we look at the end of the solicitation when we are bringing forward funding options, different options for TAB and the council to look at. That is kind of the point in time where we take off our regional hat and we say, okay, how did we do with balancing these projects across the region to make sure that even areas that might not have had the best scoring projects still are somehow being represented in the outcomes. And one of the things we've always emphasized is that most often the solicitation kind of on its own has done a pretty good job of geographic balance. And this slide just shows what we funded in the 2018 solicitation. So, you know, 37 different cities and townships received projects. We had representation of projects in all 7 counties. And so that was, at the end of the process, a very important discussion, but it's often hard for people to wait until the end, till we get to that discussion. And so balancing, not trying to use geographic balance at the output, is one of our key things that we've been trying to work with TAB and the work group. And there are ways that you can design the solicitation so that it does a better job of giving you regional balance. And one of the things we have been using is what we call funding guarantees, where essentially if you have projects that just don't score very well, and through the years we've noticed that, you can have a guarantee that you will fund a project in a certain category. And one of the funding guarantees we've had in place for the last 3 solicitations, we have a functional classification of roads known as connectors. Connectors are in the rural areas of the region. Typically, they won't score very well on some of the big criteria and measures that we use. And so for the last 3 solicitations, we have put in place a guarantee that in each solicitation, at least one project will be funded across all roadway categories, which results in funding a connector project. And in the last solicitation, in fact, it was, I think, the bridge we just defederalized with your last action, but it was in Anoka County as a connector project. So moving on to the recommendations that I'll be going through today. As I said, after each solicitation, we review the process. We survey applicants, scorers, tab members, council members, and get an idea of what worked well and what could use improvement. After the last solicitation, some of the major topics that were identified related to the scoring of the equity criteria and measures, transit specifically related to how the arterial BRT projects scored and how that could be reflected differently, and then also unique projects. So those are the three topics I'll be getting into some detail on today. The policy work group that developed the recommendations met 6 times in the last 3 or 4 months. And as I said, it did also include 2 council members on it. We presented the recommendations to TAB last Wednesday, and they were very well received, but there still is a little bit of confusion over the transit recommendations. And so the work group is going to get to meet one more time next week and finalize the transit recommendations. And then we'll bring an update to you on what comes out of that discussion. And then TAB will be adopting the recommendations and releasing the full application for public comment at its September meeting. So before I get into the recommendations, we had neglected to attach to the agenda a document that looks like this. It was attached today, so you might not have seen it, and you might want to call that up on your iPad. It goes into quite a bit more detail than I'm going to be going into on the overall recommendations, but you might want to refer to it as I go along. One of the bigger decisions that TAB makes at the outset of the solicitation is how many application categories will be included under each of the modal categories: roadways, transit, bike, and ped. So the graphic shown here it relates to some of the major recommendations moving forward. In the past, we had 9 application categories along with a base level allocation for travel demand management activities. So really 10 categories, though one of them kind of came off the top. With this solicitation, we are now proposing to go and add 2 additional categories, one in spot mobility projects under the roadway category and one for the BRT program. I'll describe that in a little bit of detail. And then also a unique projects category, which is not quite new, but in the past it's kind of been an ill-defined category. And with this solicitation, we are going to put more structure on that category and also allocate specific funding to the unique projects. So I'm going to go somewhat by mode for the policy work group recommendations. The roadway recommendations are primarily technical in nature, and they did go in front of the policy work group, but the original recommendations were run through a technical roadway work group that's really where most of them originated. The first one, as I mentioned, we are recommending a new spot mobility and safety application category. This category will be aimed at smaller, almost intersection type projects, so they'll be smaller in nature. And in the past, those were included in roadway expansion and did not always score as well as the larger projects, but they tend to be smaller, low cost, but very high benefit projects. So creating a spot mobility category where they kind of compete against themselves made some sense. The other thing with this category, we will have a smaller maximum award of $3.5 million rather than $7 million in the other roadway categories. And this, we think, will help us get a little bit more geographic balance by funding a higher number of projects under the spot mobility category. A second recommendation is to create a new measure for pedestrian safety improvements. It's a qualitative measure whereby applicants will discuss how their project impacts pedestrian safety. Pedestrian safety, you're probably all aware, has really been growing at a rate not seen in our other areas of accident categories, and so putting a bigger focus on pedestrian safety seemed to be something everyone wanted to do. We had some discussion early on about combining the modernization reconstruction roadway category along with bridges, partly just to have fewer application categories. In the end, the technical group thought that those two project types were too different to score against one another and recommended leaving them separate as two separate application categories, so they will remain that way. In the past, we have also had a requirement that at least 10 million in funding be spent in the bridge application category. We're recommending eliminating that minimum spending, and in the end that will give TAB a lot more flexibility as to where it draws the lines across the funding categories. And a good example of that would be if we had two projects that totaled 9.7 million. When we have this in place, we have to fund a third project, and oftentimes the bridge projects are $7 million, and it might put you into a situation of going up to 17 million rather than 10 million. And so that minimum in the past has been a bit of a problem. In the traffic management technology applications, there's a recommendation to decrease the maximum award from 7 million to 3.5. Generally, those projects are small in nature anyway, and again, this will help us, we think, fund more projects and help achieve geographic balance by having more projects funded. And then finally, in the roadway applications, there is a recommendation to increase the maximum award for what were formerly called expansion projects. We're now referring to as strategic capacity projects, from 7 to 10 million. The primary emphasis there is expansion projects over the years have just gotten a lot more expensive, and typically we expect funding from MnDOT for the expansion projects as part of the local match, and MnDOT has been in a position of not being able to fund as many local projects or to help match the projects, and this will likely fund fewer expansion projects but allow them to receive a higher level of funding and be able to accomplish the entire project. So that is the roadway recommendations. I'll pause there and make sure there's no questions on the roadway.
Any questions from council members? Oh, keep on going.
The bike and ped has really just one major recommendation, and that is to decrease the maximum award for multi-use trail and bicycle facilities projects from 5.5 to 4 million. This again is aimed at trying to fund more projects. In general, this category gets the largest number of applications. The last solicitation, 40 applications were submitted in this area. And by having a lower maximum, we think we'll get more projects funded and again help achieve geographic balance. This has been a little bit controversial because particularly Minneapolis and St. Paul tend to have larger bike and trail facility projects and have been concerned about lowering the maximum. And we are going to be bringing forward, I believe, a little bit more technical information on what lowering the maximum would have done in the past solicitations, and that was requested by TAB at the presentation last week. And I think they might consider revisiting this, but this is still going to be the work group recommendation moving forward. So equity and housing performance. This is one of the bigger recommendations coming from the work group. A little bit of background on how equity and housing performance has been included in the solicitation in the past. Housing performance has been a scoring measure within the solicitation for over 20 years. So it has a long-standing history. And we have been using what we call the housing performance score that is calculated by the Council Community Development Division each year. And that has been the scoring measure for quite some time. In 2014, there was a major evaluation of the regional solicitation, and quite a bit of new thinking went into the solicitation at that time. And one of the things that was put into the solicitation in 2014 were measures for equity and to help judge projects by how they addressed equity. And at that time, the areas of concentrated poverty were somewhat of a new concept at the council, and those were incorporated into the solicitation and used as a scoring measure too. So equity in the past has been scored by first asking the applicant to demonstrate how the project provides benefits and impacts to what we've been referring to as equity communities, but in the tab definition that includes low income, people of color, disabled populations, youth, and elderly. So it's a little bit of a broader definition than typically used in, like for instance, in Thrive, MSP 2040. And so it was a qualitative response of how the project benefited these populations, how these populations were engaged, and then at the end, there is a multiplier that was used to multiply each applicant's score. And applicants that were in areas of concentrated poverty with 50% people of color could receive 100% of the score. Areas of concentrated poverty received 80%. Areas above the regional average received 60%. And all other areas, their score was multiplied by 40%. And that equity multiplier proved to be somewhat controversial because we had applicants who might do an excellent job in thinking about equity and how their project could benefit particular populations, and maybe even engage those populations very deeply, but in the end, they would be multiplied by 40% and could only receive 40% of the equity score. And so what that tended to do was, for some applicants, it really discounted the equity scoring because they would in their mind think, well, I can only get 40% of the points. I'm not going to spend my time thinking about that issue or addressing that issue. And I think it had a lot of impact of working against what we are trying to achieve, which is that everyone thinks about how their project can impact equity populations. So I probably am getting a little bit ahead of myself. So the two recommendations that are coming out of the policy work group are first that we keep the housing performance measure, but that we reduce the scoring for housing performance from 70 points to 50 points, and that is across all application categories, and that the freed up 20 points be moved into the equity measures, and that they be allocated in total 40% towards demonstrating how the project engaged equity populations and provided outreach to those populations, and how the response had an impact on what the project that is being proposed, and that 60% of the points be for how the applicant addresses the benefits provided by the project to equity populations. So that's the first piece of the recommendation. And then the second piece is to replace the multiplier that I just described with bonus points. So rather than being a disincentive, it would give all applicants the chance to score 100% of the points. And then for those applicants that did a really excellent job at responding to the engagement and benefits portion of the question and scored at least 80% on those measures, then the applicant would be given the opportunity to be allocated bonus points, and the bonus points are predicated upon the geographic location of the project. And you can see there, so the highest bonus points are given to areas of concentrated poverty with 50% people of color, 20 points for areas of concentrated poverty, 15 points for census tracts where the project is located that have poverty or minor or people of color populations above the regional average, and then 10 points for all other areas. And so this revision is really meant to give everyone the opportunity to score fully on the equity points, but then recognize that areas of concentrated poverty and people of color need additional benefit and have the opportunity to get the highest level of bonus points.
Let's have you pause for a quick second. We do have a question. I know I will say that there was a lot of discussion at the workgroup and at TAB about this, and I think really the key thing that this gets across, I think that is an improvement, is people really have to think about equity and the benefits and potential negative impacts of projects up front, and really have to consider that to be able to kind of get an opportunity for the other points. Councilmember Chambliss, so you had a question?
Yes, thank you for adding that extra piece about, having to think about it versus just kind of being a little bit more generic about how to get the extra points. I'm curious about the net impact to the areas of concentrated poverty where it moves from 100% to 80%. Has that been looked at, or is that what you're showing right here?
Madam Chair and Member Chambliss, the areas of concentrated poverty with 50% people of color, even with the multiplier, were given, that's where they had 100% of the points. And what this is saying is those areas still get the highest opportunity for bonus points, but only applicants that do a really excellent job on addressing both engagement and the benefits of the project and score 80% can get the bonus points. And so what you would see here is a good example would be under roadway expansion, 50 points are possible for equity, 20 on engagement and 30 on benefits. An applicant would have to score at least 40 points between those two measures to get the bonus points. That would be 80% of the 50.
Okay, so if you were to do this chart based on the way that it's scored today, what is changing on the columns as far as the numbers? Can you show that or provide that?
I can, Madam Chair and Member Chambliss, I can provide it. Again, taking specifically the roadway expansion, equity between community engagement and benefits in the past was only 30 points. Because what we're also shifting points from the housing into equity. So in total, the equity points have gotten higher. And then on top of it, there's the opportunity for the bonus points.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And if you can send the kind of the before and the after, as even if the columns are slightly different, that's
We'll make sure we get that out to you. Director Thompson, you had a
I think in that same example, Madam Chair, council members, in the current one, without these changes, after you scored those points, you would then be reduced points based on where your project is located. And now we're shifting to more benefits if you've done a really good job there, and then we look at where the project is located after that and assign more points rather than reducing based on the geographic location. That's how it currently is with that factor of 80% or 40%.
Madam Chair, Mr. Thompson, thank you for that clarification. If I could also see kind of a scenario where locations are benefiting with the new changes, kind of just have it highlighted. Like, for example, let's just assume that they scored higher based on their engagement and their, the plan that they put in place, and that they're going to get a higher score based on that. If I could look at that scenario as well as, the two different charts as to what it is current state and then potentially the future state with the equity measure changes and the different multipliers.
We can, I'm sure, get you something. It might be hard for us to come, I'm speaking for staff, so yell at me if I'm completely wrong, to do a scenario now, but maybe we could look at how a project would be scored under comparable circumstances with this versus the old one. Might be a little challenging to do. One thing we do with the regional solicitation, which is part of what informed this exercise, was we do an after analysis. I think Mr. Peterson was here presenting that at one point of, sort of the outcomes of different things, what were sort of the items that led to changes in scoring and that type of thing. We'll do that again with this, and so we'll kind of continue, because I think every time we look at this over time, like, this is definitely, I would say, I'm very happy with this improvement, and Amy put a ton of work into this, and I think it's really quite fantastic. And but we'll look and see, because we want to keep improving again. So that's sort of how we try and do this. So as we do the solicitation cycles, it gets reevaluated. So hopefully we can see where we're making an impact and or not need to improve. So does that even, okay, Councilmember Cummings? And then.
Thank you, Chair. I think also with this change, one of the things, so with the provided applicant workshops and learning sessions on equity engagement, identifying project needs and solutions, whether you are funded or not, it changes the thinking around the application. And the spillover effect, hopefully, is that it begins to change the thinking around every thing, not just projects that are being that are part of the regional solicitation process, but everything else. Looking at the engagement, looking at the solutions, and all of the things that are going to be done through training, because I don't know who that will be aimed at directly, but clearly there will be staff and others who are involved in other areas beyond just regional solicitation projects that will learn from this and be able to start hopefully thinking about this in a very different way. And I think that could be a huge benefit as well. So I know this was a big shift and a lot of work, and I think it can have so much benefit across the board on so many things even unrelated to this. So I think it's really an important change.
I agree with, especially with the outreach to the counties and the cities who submit applications. I've heard a great deal of positive feedback from them having the opportunity for these workshops, because they're all starting to talk about this as well. And so it's a good chance for us to be out there and explain how we want this to work, but also have some of those conversations so they have tools to talk about it themselves. Councilmember Fredson.
Thank you, Chair. Two questions related to the recommendations on bicycle and pedestrians. So just so I understand, the total awards by modal category, this doesn't mean that bike and ped investments would be less than they have been historically. It just, there would be a similar amount of resources spread around more projects. Is that correct?
Yeah, Madam Chair. Yes, that is correct. They're just individual project could not receive as much as before, but the category would stay as similar to what has been in the past.
Okay, and then a follow-up. So in slide 9 there's a reference to cities, potential financial burden for cities in this application category, and I'm just trying to, is that cities versus county? Is that just recognizing that some cities raise concerns at the tab? And if I recall a conversation with Councilmember Tolbert, who represents St. Paul on the tab, I think the argument is that for instance, the bike path that we just built through downtown St. Paul, that most of the land is developed and land is more expensive versus land, say, in the suburbs or exurbs. And so it would be more expensive to build these projects in the city versus in the city of St. Paul versus elsewhere throughout the metro. Is that a fair or accurate kind of assessment? Or?
So, Madam Chair, Councilmember Fredson, I think there's two issues there. The first issue you brought up about the cities having enough local match. As we were struggling with the recommendation on lowering the maximum, there was a suggestion that we could also lower the amount of federal funds to 70% rather than 80%. And so that was brought up by the work group, and they asked for technical feedback on that issue. So when we brought that to TAC, the feedback was, one, they did not like the idea that one category would have a lower federal match amount than would the other categories. And then they cited the reason that cities who are common applicants in that category might be taken by surprise and likely would not be planning on that higher level of local match. So that came back to TAB, and at this point in time, TAB hasn't made any decisions, but I think the expectation is that they would not go with the lower federal amount in that category. But, and then they also haven't made a final recommendation on lowering the maximum either. And I think one of the things they're struggling with is what you brought up there, that in particular projects in the urban core do tend to just be more expensive. They, whether it's right-of-way costs or just construction costs in general. So it was Minneapolis and St. Paul in particular that were emphasizing wanting to keep the maximum at a higher level.
Director Thompson.
And Madam Chair, members, they also, I think they asked the technical group to come back with some options where maybe there could be a mix of lowering that max to 4 million, but allow one or more larger projects too. And so some options are going to be brought back to TAB that the technical groups are working on, kind of to address that issue, but also you start to dilute some of the goals of the working group too, to lower the max so you get more projects. If you start raising the max on a couple, you've kind of lost some of that advantage. We'll bring some options, but not sure where they'll decide to go on that.
Madam Chair and members, before I move on to unique projects, I did want to say a couple words about the proposed workshops. We really are emphasizing that they're more learning sessions on the equity measures, and what we're hoping is they'll be voluntary, but we're hoping most applicants will choose to attend. I've been meeting with Mitzi Kennedy of our OEO office, and we are thinking that she and her staff will have a major role in helping design and help facilitate those workshops along with some other individuals from around the council. And they're really meant to help applicants understand of what does it mean to engage communities, what are the types of questions and tools you can use for engagement, how can you design your project to better meet the issues and needs that are being identified through engagement, how to think about benefits to communities. And so it really is an opportunity to have the conversation and have our partners, our technical partners, learn and understand what we're talking about when we ask these questions and how to respond to them. And as a scorer in the last solicitation, I'll say people genuinely want to address it, but they don't know how. And so there's a lot of learning that needs to take place and understanding. And I think one of the things we'll hear is that people, it's hard to do that without having funding. And we understand that, but it's also important because otherwise the conversations aren't taking place before a project is funded, and that's when they should be taking place. And so it's a little bit of getting ahead of the game, getting ahead of the curve, and making little strides. And hopefully 4 years from now, we'll have a lot of applicants who have thought about the issues, better understand them, and over time, better address them with the projects that are submitted to the solicitation. So we do think it's not just the scoring, it's the workshops and the conversations that are an important piece of this recommendation. So moving on to unique projects. Unique projects have been, unique projects are basically defined as projects that don't fit into our modal application categories, and they don't fit typically because they cross modes. They're something the region has not seen or tested in the past. Oftentimes they involve innovation or technology. And in the last solicitation, we did have St. Paul Our Car electric vehicle mobility hub project that technically was eligible in one of the categories, but the maximum amount of funding really didn't work for a large capital project. And so TAB ended up spending a lot of time and energy talking about unique projects and making a decision on what to do specifically with that project. And we have also encountered that issue in past solicitations. So this in 2018 wasn't the first time. So in looking at unique projects, the work group really thought it would be a benefit to create a unique projects application category, and maybe most importantly, to set aside funding for the category, because what happens if we talk about funding at the end of the process, then the unique projects are taking funding away from other categories because it has not been articulated that this category would be provided with any funding. Also, because unique projects tend to be innovative, there was a desire to move the selection closer to when the funding would be available. So as I mentioned earlier, in the 2020 solicitation, the funding is not available until 2024 or 2025. So what we are recommending is that we put unique projects selection closer. And in this case, we would set aside the funding in 2020, but not actually select any unique projects until the following solicitation in 2022. And one of the advantages of putting that off a little bit is that it also gives TAB an opportunity to really create the criteria and the evaluation process that will be used to select the unique projects in the interim time. And so that is the unique projects recommendation that will be going forward to TAB. And with that recommendation, it shows up on the modal funding ranges as essentially a modal category. So we now have roadways, transit, TDM, bike and ped, and unique projects. And unique projects has exactly a 2.5% of the funding, while the other categories have a range of funding that might be allocated to them. And we won't know what is actually selected until we get to the project selection point at next fall of 2020. We would have that discussion.
Councilmember Chambliss.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Ms. Menowitz. So that 2.5% unique funding, the impact on the other categories to the left, is that going to be determined during the review process, or has that 2.5% been taken from some of the other categories, and if so, which?
Madam Chair and members, TAB is thinking of the 2.5 essentially as being off the top. And so it will come off the top, and then the remaining funds would essentially be split in the funding amount shown under each of the other modal categories. So it would be a proportionate reduction across the other three categories.
Okay, Madam Chair. And so it's being put at the top to guarantee funding for that category?
Director Thompson. Someone's trying to find you.
Madam Chair, members, but if there are no unique projects submitted, which is a possibility, other than we do think that travel behavior inventory will be funded out of this, but then that money goes back to the other modes. And so it's set aside, but only if there's good projects that are submitted, which is not a guarantee. But in the past, last time, they didn't set aside money, and the St. Paul Our Car project became a big issue because at the end they were trying to see which pot of money to take it from, and that became the discussion whether or not, instead of is this a good project, and now you're taking the funding decision out at the front end and letting the projects apply, and then saying if there's a good project, this is how much would be available for it.
Okay.
But it has to be approved by TAP, but there's good.
Madam Chair, thank you. All right, I have a lot of questions. I'll probably have some after this meeting. You said the travel behavior is a likely candidate at the inventory, and we had a recent presentation about that. I'll have some questions about that. Any others?
Madam Chair, members, just because that is when we would apply, that's why I can say that we know that we'd apply for that, the council applies for that, but the others, we do not know who would apply, but I think things like shared mobility are categories, innovative transit, electrification has been one that has been one of certain types of the infrastructure has been something that has come up in the past that I could see as an opportunity, but as of this point, we haven't heard of any, but there's 2 years to go before that.
And I would say the discussion really was TAB wanted to be part of or have an opportunity to allow new technology and innovation to be something and be one of the principles that we're working towards, to have be able to be forward looking. And so this was one tool that I think that the working group really came to consensus with, that we wanted to have available. And again, we said we'll do this and have the money set aside, but if there aren't projects, then it goes back into funding things across the region. Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Joe. Does the amount of funding that we receive ever vary?
Madam Chair and Member Cummings, the amount of funding we have been receiving has been right around $180 million for the past 2 to 3 solicitations. One of the things that varies is how much we choose to overprogram. And we overprogram primarily because we know projects fall out along the way. And so what has been happening in the past couple solicitations is the overprogramming level has gone up. And at the same time, what we are finding is fewer projects are falling out along the way. So right now, due to the past over-programming, we look like we might be over-programmed too much. And so within this solicitation, we'll still have, we think, $180 million available. But for instance, in the last solicitation, we actually programmed a little over $200 million. So I think that will be the discussion that needs to take place, is maybe in this next solicitation, we'll actually program the 180 rather than over-program due to the past over-programming.
Thank you.
All right, any additional questions right now? All right. Okay.
So moving on to the last recommendation is related to transit. And this recommendation is still going back to the work group, but a little bit of background on why it came forward. After the last solicitation, we received feedback related to arterial bus rapid transit applications, and it really had 2 issues related to that. The first was that the ABRT projects are typically the top scoring projects. They are the projects usually that get funded, and the scores are a wide margin higher than the other transit project. And that is primarily because they do the best job at going back to our regional priorities and the outcomes that we're looking for. So we've had ABRT projects scoring very well in the past 3 solicitations, somewhere on the range of 25 to I think 31 or 32 million. Typically what happens is the arterial BRTs show up both in expansion projects and in modernization for different elements of the project. For instance, the technology improvements and the stations typically would be in modernization, and then the service buses, that type of thing, shows up in expansion. And so while we get quite a bit of funding for arterial BRT, they've had to piecemeal the projects themselves, and then also typically apply on 1 to 2 to 3 arterial BRT lines. So the arterial BRT has been receiving a lot of funding, but no one project has been completely funded, which leads to a piecemeal implementation process for building out the arterial BRT system. And then the second issue that has been occurring is that the other transit applications have typically been submitted by the suburban transit providers, and they don't score well against the arterial BRT applications. And then we also typically see areas of the region that do not receive any transit projects, resulting in geographic imbalance across the region. So looking at this, we did receive comments from both sides of the issue of we don't think it's good to have all the transit applications competing against arterial BRT, and also that arterial BRT was being implemented in a somewhat inefficient manner. So given that, the policy work group recommended that we create a program for bus rapid transit in general. And right now, 2 options are still being considered for that program. The first is that the program be funded at a level of 25 to 28 million for new bus rapid transit project, and specifically for only those lines that are in the TPP, either current revenue or increased revenue scenario, and that projects that are either small or new starts expansion projects be excluded from the program, and also improvements to existing BRT lines be excluded. And one of the reasons the new starts exclusion is being suggested is that those projects have another very substantial funding source through the New Starts program, whereas arterial BRT projects, this is really their only federal funding source in which to compete. The second option is to fund the program at a little bit higher level from 25 to 31 million, and allow all forms of bus rapid transit projects to compete within the program, including the small starts, new starts projects, and improvements to existing lines. And then how that program would come forward with recommendations is yet to be determined, and TAB made it very clear that they want the policymakers to be involved in having that discussion of what would the process be for bringing forward the program recommendations. The intent would be to bring the recommendation forward around the April timeframe next year, so that we know what's in the BRT program prior to selecting projects through the other solicitation application categories. And then the second big part of that recommendation is to create a guarantee that would fund a transit project outside of what we call transit market areas 1 and 2, And on this map, those areas are shown in the dark blue and the lighter blue. They're the core of the region with some of the first-ring suburbs. And so the recommendation would be that we fund at least one project in the green areas that has at least one, if it's a service project, it would have to have at least one end of the project outside of the market areas 1 and 2. And this part of the recommendation really is hand in hand with the BRT program recommendation. It's aimed at giving us geographic balance and recognizing that the BRT program will primarily be focused in the urban core, in the blue areas, and also recognizing that if we broaden the definition of BRT, that if we did fund a BRT project in the green areas, that would count as part of the guarantee for funding for transit. So that issue is still being dealt with in the policy work group, and we will expect a recommendation in the next couple of weeks. And with no questions on that, the last recommendation we have here came out of our technical groups, and this applies to any project that is going to apply for the regional solicitation. All applicants, we are requiring that they have a completed ADA transition plan, and this is really in accordance with federal law. And in the last solicitation, they had to have been working towards a plan. And now at this point in time, we are requiring that there is actually an adopted plan. And then also the applicants must submit a letter committing any funding that they receive, that they will commit to snow and ice control if they receive funding through the multi-use trail and bicycle facilities category. This is our schedule moving forward. So we would be releasing the solicitation for public review in September, receiving comments and doing some revisions in the fall, and having a final application packet in November. In December, the council will be asked to concur with the application packet. It will be released to applicants in February of 2020, applications due in April, and then final selection of projects next late fall, November, December timeframe. And that is it on the regional solicitation.
Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On the ADA transition plan, is that something that gets submitted to the Met Council to conform to certain requirements that the Met Council has, or is that something that they simply say they have in place?
Madam Chair and Member Cummings, it is simply something that they agree and validate with us that they have an adopted plan, and we don't have a role in overseeing what's actually in the plan.
Okay, thank you.
Director Thompson.
Madam Chair, members, but we as the council is an applicant for this, and so we've been working on the council's ADA transition plan, knowing that this date was coming, and I think it'll come before the council prior to this April timeframe. It's in the works, and so the council needs to have one also as part of this requirement.
Thank you.
Okay. Any additional questions from council members? All right, thank you, Amy. Oh, sorry, Councilmember Fredson.
Thank you. One question is whether or not these funding allocations take into consideration whether or not counties are, bringing in all available resources. And I ask because Hennepin County just raised the wheelage tax, and I don't believe that all of the counties in the metro are, maximizing their wheelage tax. And so is that factored into resource allocations or no?
Director Thompson.
Madam Chair, Councilmember, no, that is not. They when an applicant applies, they do say they will commit the local or non-federal share to the project to complete it in whatever source they can have, but we have not linked that has not linked it to things like wheelage tax or anything. It's just a commitment that they will deliver the project
When they're
for
shared.
whatever's needed above what they receive from the federal.
Thank you.
All right, one last time. Any other questions? All right, thank you, Amy. We're on to our last information item, which is the second quarter ridership report. We have Becky McBride.
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. My name is Rebecca McBride. I am a Senior Project Administrator with Metropolitan Transportation Services. I will be presenting the second quarter Metropolitan Council Ridership Report. This report is cumulative, so we will be comparing year-to-date ridership 2019 to 2018 for the first 2 quarters of the year, January through June. The first slide shows ridership by month as it compares to 2018. 2019 fell below 2018 riderships for all months except April. This next slide shows council ridership by mode. It breaks down the various modes of service. The majority you can see in blue is our local ridership. It's over half of our ridership for our service. Light rail for the blue and green lines is about 30%. We also provide commuter and express service, 10%, and then there's BRT and various other services, including Transit Link, Vanpool, and ADA service. The next slide shows the actual numbers for ridership. You will notice a significant increase in the bus rapid transit due to the opening of Sea Line on June 8th. Now observations. Metro Transit experienced significant ridership loss on local service for the first 2 quarters of 2019 due to the poor weather conditions through April. That was discussed for first quarter with the bad weather in January, and that just continued through. BRT had the opening of Sea Line on June 8th, which added an additional 110,000 rides during its first months of operation. The rail modes did a little better. Green Line had its 4th month of ridership records for the line. There is a kind of a balance between, or more of a fight between light rail growth and the bus decline. The final 4 happened in April, which contributed to the higher ridership identified in the earlier slide. That particularly helped the Green Line. Other observations, Metro Mobility has a slight increase. The expectation is that they're going to increase 5 to 6%. That's been what's happening for the last 6 years. It was just a little slow early on this year because of the weather. Transit Link is seeing some decline in Hennepin and Washington counties, and Metro Vanpool has stayed kind of consistent with the 55 Vanpools. Okay, open for questions.
Councilmember Chambliss.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. McBride, I have a question about the observations in terms of the growth or challenges with the NCAA Final Four ridership having a positive impact. If we took the events out, the big events like the NCAA or a big, Super Bowl game or something like that, what would our rail mode growth look like? Or, is it a wash? Are we under? Someone,
Madam Chair, Councilmember, I think that's an excellent question. There's lots of events that occur throughout the year and each year that are unique. The Super Bowl, the NCAA Final Four, we've added the Alliance Field service, and I've actually asked for that same question to see how we can better normalize these numbers. For example, in terms of local ridership, we now have bus rapid transit as a separate category, and that moves local ridership into bus rapid transit. And so I think we need to figure out how to better normalize. But there's a broader question of what's going on here that I think we need to have a better answer to. We know, for example, on local ridership that the impact of shared mobility, like such as bikes and scooters and so forth, affect local ridership than it would more other services, because it's that short trip element that it affects, and Uber and Lyft do the same thing. So I say all this to say there's a lot of moving pieces going on here that we don't have as much of a handle on that I would like, and we're asking those same questions.
And I also had a similar question, and you kind of addressed it, was so there's decrease in the local ridership and increase in the BRT. So what effect did opening the Sea Line have on the local numbers? But it would be good to see that sort of teased out at some point.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I would also add that for that example, the same is true for comparing year over year in ABRT, because the prior year to opening, you have a construction year that could affect the ridership along that corridor as well. So it's a much more complicated story than what we could put on here. I didn't mean to confuse you more, but these are the right questions to ask, I think.
All right, Councilmember Chambliss.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the additional information, Mr. Quistra. I think it would also be nice to continue to have some of these big events, the NCAA Super Bowl. If we can keep those coming, then that helps too, doesn't it?
That's right. Excuse me, Madam Chair. Agree wholeheartedly. We like them.
How about the World's Fair?
Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On a variety of festivals and things like that, there are bus passes that are available for free. I know we attended one over the summer. It was East African celebration over by Allianz Field or whatever, and you could download a pass and ride for free. So my question is, on those various things, activities where you can download a pass for free, what's the cost to Metro Transit approximately, and what is the goal? Is the hope that you will be introducing riders to transit in general, to new transit users, or what is the goal of that?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Cummings, the goal is to have more people have experience with transit and use transit. In respect to the cost to us, we tried to get the like value of those passes in sponsorship advertising opportunity. So we try to say there is no such thing as a free pass, and we're always looking at what sort of sponsorship opportunity we have to get our name out there, and advertising value, and our marketing people do that when we make those determinations, exchanges.
Just to follow up, I think they're great. Do you have a way of sort of identifying how successful the projects are, or you just hope for the best?
Madam Chair, I don't know if I like the choices, but I think it's somewhere in between. I'm being frank. I think that we do this as generally to expose ourselves to communities. I think that's a good thing. Some of those values of that's not quantitative. So are we getting every dollar for every free pass back in a quantitative way? I'm not sure, but we get branding value that serves us over time, I think, in many of these cases, and we get exposure to communities that we wouldn't otherwise have exposure to, and that plays out over time.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Any Councilmember Fredson?
Thank you, Chair. So I know we've been presented with this in the past, but I'm just trying to remember this trend. Right? When was the last time that we were at a sort of trending downward in terms of ridership? At what point in recent history were we peaking, or?
Madam Chair, committee member, I believe the year was 2016. It's either 2016 or 2017. I'd have to verify that. But we had record high ridership. It was so close to, it's like 900. I'm sorry.
Okay, so
I'm-
it's
I'm-
relatively recent though. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just been in the last couple of years.
And so, yes, and I think this is also really reflective of a national trend that's been going on with the local bus routes as well. So, yep. All right. Any additional questions? All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And with that, we're done with all of our items for the. Thank you for reminding me. The next meeting on September 9th will actually be canceled because, and so we're moving, our next meeting where we get together will be September 23rd. All right, and with that, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.